He thought he was just helping a stranger in need, but he had no idea that the woman he gave his last chocolate bar to was the daughter of a powerful ruler. Now Jace Turlock, a simple diplomat, is caught in a high-stakes trial, a test of strength, wisdom, and devotion that could change the course of his life. With each trial pushing him further to his limits, the connection between him and Princess Althea deepens, but so does the danger surrounding them. Can Jace survive the trials, prove his worth, and secure a future with the woman who holds the power to reshape the galaxy? The clock is ticking and the final trial awaits, but are they ready for what it will truly reveal? If you're new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a blistering heat over the sprawling city of Solara. Its twin suns beat down relentlessly on Captain Jace Turlock, who was making his way through the winding streets of the desert metropolis. Sweat dripped from his brow as he pulled at the collar of his environment suit, grateful for the protection it offered, but aware that even the best tech had its limits. The air was dry, thick with the scent of sand and ancient stone. Jace had just completed a long day of negotiations with the local merchant guild. His mission, as a diplomatic envoy of the intergalactic coalition, was to secure a trade deal that would benefit Earth's economy, but the talks had dragged on longer than expected. Now, as the heat of the midday sun blazed down upon him, Jace was stuck walking back to his quarters. The streets were mostly empty, as was typical during these peak hours. Any sane being would be inside, seeking refuge from the scorching temperatures. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and muttered to himself, "Damn heat." His words were barely audible over the distant hum of the city, a strange blend of old and new architecture. Towering bioorganic buildings merged with the more traditional Middle Eastern-inspired structures that had survived centuries of harsh climates. It was a city that looked as though it had grown rather than been built. Its curves and angles made it feel alive, as if it was part of the desert itself. As he made his way through the streets, his eyes scanned the surroundings. The heat, the dust, and the emptiness of the city were beginning to get to him, but as he passed by an alleyway, something caught his attention. A figure huddled in the shadow of a massive building, a figure that, at first glance, seemed out of place. It was a woman. Well, at least she appeared to be female, though Jace couldn't be sure from her posture. She had a pale, almost ethereal skin tone that shimmered faintly under the harsh sunlight. Her silvery hair fell in disheveled waves around her face, as though she hadn't bothered to comb it in days. She was wearing simple, worn clothes, barely suited for the extreme conditions of Solara's desert. Yet, despite her apparent distress, there was something about the way she held herself that made Jace pause. Even in the midst of such visible discomfort, she carried herself with an air of quiet dignity. Her posture was straight, her gaze sharp. It was as if she was someone who had once known power, but had since fallen on hard times. Jace hesitated for a moment, wondering if she needed help. He wasn't a man who often gave away his resources, especially not on a planet like this. But something about her caught his attention. As he drew closer, the woman looked up at him. Her eyes were like liquid mercury, sharp, calculating, but also filled with curiosity. They locked onto his for a moment, and Jace felt a strange shiver run down his spine. She looked at him as if she were sizing him up, assessing his worth. The moment stretched, heavy with silent understanding. "Are you lost?" Jace asked, breaking the silence. She didn't immediately respond, but her eyes flickered to the small pouch on his belt. The pouch that held the last of his sustenance, a specialized nutrient bar worth more than gold in a place like this. He had one left, the very last of his rations, and he had been saving it for the journey back to his ship. It wasn't much, but it could keep him going for another day. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes flicked back to the bar, and Jace saw a flicker of hunger in them. It was subtle, but it was there. In that moment, Jace made a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bar, holding it out to her. "Here," he said. "You look like you could use it more than me." She stared at the offering as though it might bite her. Jace wasn't sure if she was suspicious or just taken aback by his sudden kindness. After a long pause, she slowly reached out and took the bar from his hand. The touch was light, but Jace felt an odd energy pass between them. Something that felt far too significant for a simple exchange of food. "People don't just give away food in places like this," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality despite the wariness in her tone. Jace shrugged, offering a small smile. "Humans know what it's like to live through hard times. That's why, if we can, we help those who have it worse." He watched her carefully as he spoke, hoping she could see the truth in his words. The kindness wasn't just about the bar, it was about something deeper, a shared understanding of struggle. He placed the bar next to her and started to turn away, but her voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, her tone softer now. Jace turned back, surprised by the shift in her demeanor. "Yeah? What's your name?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his face. "Jace," he replied simply. "Jace Turlock." He was about to add something else, but she interrupted him. "Thank you, Jace," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'm Althea." "Take care of yourself, Althea," he said with a nod, then turned and continued his walk. But as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just occurred. Something that would, in time, change the course of his mission. Little did he know, the woman he had just helped was not as she seemed. Althea, the mysterious figure he had stumbled upon in the streets, was no ordinary beggar. She was a princess, and the kindness of a stranger was about to set into motion a chain of events that would alter the fate of an entire galaxy. As Jace walked back toward his ship, he had no idea that his simple act of generosity would lead him into the heart of a royal mystery. But the universe, it seemed, had its own plans, and sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to change everything. The days passed in a blur for Jace. After his unexpected meeting with Althea, he returned to his quarters and tried to focus on his mission. But her face kept drifting back into his thoughts, as though etched into his mind by some unseen hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter was more than just a coincidence, but what exactly had it meant, and who was she really? 3 days later, Jace found himself standing in the grand reception hall of the Sovereign's palace. He had been summoned for another round of negotiations, this time with the highest authority of Lyra 30, Sovereign Kalen. As a diplomat, Jace had met with countless leaders from various planets, but something about this meeting felt different. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the fate of the trade agreement rested on his shoulders, or perhaps it was the strange feeling in his chest, an unease he couldn't place. The reception hall was unlike any Jace had ever seen. Towering golden, arches stretched towards the ceiling, supported by intricate bioluminescent columns that pulsed with soft light. The walls shimmered with the glow of holographic displays, each showcasing artifacts from distant worlds. Everything in the room radiated wealth and power, yet there was an underlying sense of history, of a civilization that had lived through countless generations. "Ambassador Turlock," a deep voice called, pulling Jace from his thoughts. "Welcome to my humble home." Jace turned to face Sovereign Kalen, the ruler of Lyra the 3. The Sovereign was an imposing figure, tall and regal, dressed in elaborate robes that seemed to float around him. His eyes, a piercing shade of violet, studied Jace with a calm yet calculating gaze. Next to the Sovereign stood a figure Jace recognized instantly, the woman from the street, Althea. But now she was no longer the dusty, disheveled figure he had met. She had been transformed. She stood before him, dressed in an elegant gown woven from what looked like starlight itself. The fabric shimmered with a soft glow, casting a faint halo around her. Her hair, once tangled and matted, now flowed in silvery waves perfectly framing her face. Her violet eyes, which had once held only curiosity, now sparkled with a mixture of amusement and something else, something Jace couldn't quite place. She was no longer a beggar, no longer a stranger in the desert heat. She was a princess. "May I introduce my daughter, Princess Althea?" Sovereign Kalen said, his voice rich with pride. "I believe you two have already met." Jace's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her, unable to hide his surprise. Princess Althea? The same woman he had helped days ago. He blinked, trying to compose himself. The realization hit him, like a shockwave, leaving him momentarily speechless. The woman he had so casually offered his last nutrient bar to was royalty, an heir to a throne, someone whose worth was beyond anything he could fathom. "Ah, yes," Jace stammered, forcing himself to speak. "We've met, though I didn't know you were a princess." Althea's lips curved into a sly smile, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and mischief. "Yes, I can see that my appearance may have been deceiving. But it was kind of you to help me, Jace. Not many would have done the same." Jace didn't know how to respond to that. His mind was racing, trying to process everything. Why had she been out there in the streets looking like a beggar? Why had she hidden her true identity from him? Was it a test, some strange game? Or had she simply not wanted to reveal herself? And now, standing in front of him as a princess, Althea was looking at him with a gaze that seemed to weigh him, measuring his worth, as if everything he had done for her was now under scrutiny. Sovereign Kalen chuckled, his voice deep and resonant. "I must say, Jace, you've certainly made an impression on my daughter. I thought she would be indifferent to human customs, but you've shown her a side of your species that she finds fascinating." Jace didn't know how to respond. He was still processing the fact that he was now in the presence of royal blood, someone who held unimaginable power and influence. He had assumed their interaction would be a fleeting moment, a brief encounter with a stranger. But now it seemed like he had stepped into something far more complex. "It's a rare thing," Althea continued, her voice soft but tinged with something that Jace couldn't place. "For someone to give so freely with no expectation of return. Your kindness, it means more to me than you know." Jace felt a pang in his chest. It wasn't the kind of praise he was used to hearing in the diplomatic circles. This was different. This was personal. And yet, he wasn't sure how to navigate the complexities of their growing connection. He was here on a mission, after all, a mission that didn't leave much room for personal feelings or distractions. But Althea, now standing before him as a princess, was no mere distraction. She was a force in her own right, and her presence was beginning to pull Jace into something he couldn't ignore. "Come," Sovereign Kalen said, breaking the momentary silence. "Let us retire to a more comfortable setting. We can discuss trade, yes, but I believe there are other matters that need our attention first." The conversation shifted back to business, but Jace couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a whirlwind. Princess Althea had captivated him, and he couldn't deny that her presence left him feeling both challenged and intrigued. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a man sharing his last food ration with a stranger, had turned into something far more significant. As they followed Sovereign Kalen deeper into the palace, Jace stole a glance at Althea. She walked beside him with a grace and confidence that made her seem even more regal than before. She was no longer the stranger he had helped in the street. Now, she was something more. Someone who had the power to change the course of his life. Little did Jace know, the path he had unwittingly set foot on was about to lead him into a world of intrigue, power, and impossible choices. The kindness he had shown was just the beginning of a much greater story, one that would shape the fate of not only himself, but the entire galaxy. The days following the revelation of Princess Althea's true identity felt like a whirlwind to Jace. One moment, he had been a simple diplomat, walking through the streets of Solara on a routine mission. Now he was entangled in the complex web of royal politics, cultural exchanges, and a growing personal connection that he wasn't sure how to handle. The palace, which had seemed so distant and intimidating when he first arrived, now felt oddly familiar. Each hallway, adorned with shimmering crystal chandeliers and intricate tapestries depicting scenes from Lyra the Three's history, seemed to blur the lines between the world of high diplomacy and the more intimate human connections Jace was beginning to form. But despite the beauty and grandeur of the palace, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Jace knew that every word he spoke and every action he took was being closely observed. The stakes of his mission had escalated far beyond the trade agreements he had been sent to negotiate. Now, his actions were being scrutinized not just by Sovereign Kalen, but by the entire court of Lyra the Third. As Jace made his way through the palace's private corridors one afternoon, he found himself in yet another meeting with Princess Althea. Their interactions had become more frequent, each time blending diplomacy with something more personal. They were supposed to be discussing trade routes, but the conversation always seemed to drift toward more intimate topics. Today, it was about human customs, a topic that had piqued Althea's curiosity ever since their first meeting. "Tell me more about your courtship rituals," she asked, her voice light but filled with genuine interest. "They seem so different from ours." Jace nearly tripped over his own feet at her question. In all his years of diplomatic service, he had never been asked about something so personal, so human. How did he explain something as complicated as human relationships to someone from a world where emotions and bonds were perceived so differently? "Well," Jace began, choosing his words carefully, "human courtship rituals, they vary greatly depending on the culture. But at the heart of it, we have this concept of mutual attraction, based on shared experiences, trust, and a willingness to be vulnerable with one another." He watched as Althea listened intently, her violet eyes sparkling with curiosity. She seemed to hang on every word as if fascinated by the very idea of human connection. Jace's words seemed to drift away, lost in the intensity of her gaze. There was a magnetic pull between them, one that neither could ignore. "And what about your own culture?" Jace asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "How do you choose a partner?" Althea smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "We have something called the heart's choice." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When a noble finds someone they desire, they can invoke this right. It overrides all other arrangements. It's very intimate." Jace swallowed, his mind racing. The idea of such a profound bond, one that could supersede all other traditions, was almost foreign to him. Yet, as Althea spoke, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her, to the way she spoke about love and choice with such raw sincerity. "Sounds romantic," Jace said softly, his voice betraying the growing intensity of his emotions. "It is," Althea replied, her voice a soft purr, "but it's also a risk. When you choose someone in this way, you're choosing to link your soul with theirs forever." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Jace's heart raced as Althea's presence seemed to envelop him. He had never felt such a connection with anyone before. Her mere proximity made his thoughts scatter, his usual diplomatic composure slipping away with every passing second. The tension between them was palpable, but Jace knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. He was here to complete a mission, and personal feelings, no matter how intense, couldn't get in the way. But Althea seemed to sense his inner conflict. She placed a hand on his arm, her fingers grazing his skin just enough to send a jolt of electricity through his body. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. Jace turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had tried to maintain a professional distance, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. "Feel what?" "The pull," Althea said, her voice barely audible. "The connection between us. It's unlike anything I've ever felt before." Jace opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. There was something between them, something powerful and undeniable. He had felt it the moment they first met, but now it was becoming impossible to ignore. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave him, felt like a piece of a puzzle slowly falling into place. Before he could speak, the door to the room opened with a soft hiss. A servant entered, bowing low to both of them. "My apologies, Your Highness Ambassador Turlock," the servant said, breaking the tension. "Sovereign Kalen requests your presence in the council chamber. It's time to discuss the trade agreements." Jace's heart sank, the moment slipping away as quickly as it had arrived. He straightened up, clearing his throat. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. "Thank you." Althea gave him a sly smile, one that made his pulse quicken. "We'll continue this conversation later, Jace. There's much more to learn about humans. And about you." As Jace left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line between duty and desire. Althea's presence had opened a door to something he hadn't anticipated, an attraction, a connection, that was quickly becoming impossible to ignore. Yet he knew he had a responsibility to his people, to the trade negotiations that brought him here in the first place. As he followed the servant to the council chamber, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep these feelings in check. The future of his mission, his life, seemed to be hanging in the balance. And, in the midst of it all, Princess Althea was the one thing he couldn't quite figure out. As he stepped into the council chamber, he caught sight of her once again standing beside her father, the sovereign. She glanced over at him, and for just a moment, their eyes locked. The pull between them was undeniable. And in that moment, Jace realized that this was no longer just a diplomatic mission. It was a battle between his heart and his duty, and he wasn't sure which one would win. The air in the sovereign's palace seemed charged with an unspoken electricity as Jace sat across from Princess Althea. The glow of the bioluminescent walls bathed the room in an otherworldly light, casting their elongated shadows across the crystal floor. It had been weeks since their first meeting in the streets of Solara, and everything had changed since then. What had started as a simple exchange between a diplomat and a stranger had blossomed into something far more complicated, something neither Jace nor Althea had planned for. The growing connection between them had not gone unnoticed. The palace staff, the advisors, even Sovereign Kalen himself, had all observed the subtle shifts in their interactions, the way they seemed to gravitate toward each other in private, their conversations often stretching far beyond the diplomatic topics at hand. Jace tried to stay focused on the mission, but every day the pull between them became harder to resist. Jace. Althea's voice cut through his thoughts, her tone soft but filled with an intensity that caught him off guard. I've been thinking about us. Jace felt his heart race. It wasn't the first time they had discussed their feelings, but something about the way she spoke now seemed different. There was a seriousness in her voice, a depth that hinted at something more than just casual conversation. About us? Jace asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Yes, she said, her violet eyes locking onto his with a look of both determination and vulnerability. I believe it's time for you to prove yourself, Jace. Prove that what we've been building here is real. She paused, taking a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. My people, they don't understand what we have. They don't understand what a human can offer. They see us as different, distant. Until now. Jace furrowed his brow, unsure of where this was heading. What do you mean? We have a tradition, Althea explained, her voice steady. The trial of unity. It is the most sacred and intimate test in our culture. If a suitor wishes to join with someone from the royal family, they must prove their worth through this trial. It tests everything, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual. She looked at him, her eyes softening. And now, Jace, it is your turn. Jace felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had heard of the trials that royals underwent to bond with their chosen mates, but he had never imagined that he would be the one to face them. The idea of such an intense, intimate test was overwhelming, especially considering the stakes. This was no longer just a matter of diplomacy. This was about his future with Althea, with her world, and the galaxy at large. Are you saying that I have to prove myself worthy of you? Jace asked, his voice quiet. Althea nodded, her expression serious. Yes, but this is not just about proving your strength or your skills. It's about something deeper. It's about understanding who we are as people, as beings, and what it means to truly connect with someone, regardless of where you come from. The weight of her words settled heavily in Jace's chest. He knew what this meant. He knew that passing this trial would not only prove his worth to Althea, but would also solidify his place in the royal court of Lyra III. It was a test that could change everything. The trial itself would unfold over 7 days, each one focused on a different aspect of their connection. The first trial would be the trial of wisdom, where Jace would have to prove his knowledge of Lyra III's history, its people, and its culture. It was a test of intellect, but also of respect, for to understand a culture, One had to listen and learn, not simply absorb information. The second trial, the trial of strength, would require Jace to face a series of physical challenges, testing his endurance, his ability to adapt, and his resolve. The warriors of Lyra 30 were known for their strength, their connection to the desert, and their ability to harness the harsh environment to their advantage. Jace, however, would have to prove that humans, too, could overcome great odds. The third trial was the trial of endurance. Jace would be forced to survive for 3 days in the wilds beyond the city, using only minimal resources and the skills he had gained through his training. It would test his physical limits, but it would also test his resilience and ability to adapt to an alien environment. The fourth trial, the trial of spirit, would be the most intense of all. It required Jace and Althea to share an empathic bond, a deep mental connection that would allow them to communicate on a level beyond words. They would enter each other's minds, sharing thoughts, emotions, and memories. It was a test of trust and vulnerability, one that would either strengthen their bond or tear it apart. The fifth trial would be the trial of devotion, where Jace would have to demonstrate his commitment to Althea, to her world, and to their future. It was a test of loyalty, a test of his willingness to embrace her culture, her traditions, and her life. The sixth trial, the trial of creation, would require Jace to propose something that would benefit not just Althea and himself, but the entire world of Lyra 30. It was a test of his diplomatic skill, his ability to think beyond personal gain and towards the greater good. The seventh and final trial would be the trial of unity. This was the ultimate test, the one that would solidify their bond, both physically and emotionally. It would involve an ancient ceremony where Jace and Althea would merge their souls through a shared ritual, a bond that would transcend species and bind them for eternity. As Jace listened to Althea's explanation, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and fear. This was no ordinary courtship. This was a trial that would push him to his limits, testing everything he had ever known about himself and the world around him. And yet, as he looked into Althea's eyes, he knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to something truly extraordinary. "I'll do it," Jace said, his voice steady but filled with a determination he hadn't felt before. "I'll prove myself worthy. For you, for us, and for the future we can build together." Althea's expression softened, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "I knew you would. But remember, Jace, this trial isn't just about proving your strength, it's about understanding who you are, and who we are together." As they prepared to begin the trials, the atmosphere in the palace seemed to change. It was as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome. Jace's heart raced, knowing that this was the moment that would define everything. It wasn't just about completing the trials. It was about what came after. About the future they would build together. In the days to come, Jace would face challenges that would test his body, mind, and soul. But no matter the outcome, one thing was clear. He and Althea were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were connected in a way that no one could fully understand. And as Jace stepped into the unknown, he knew that this was only the beginning of a much greater journey.